second mission statement. The mission of our center is to advance social entrepreneurship in the region and nationally and globally. And social entrepreneurship, at the end of the day, is the bringing together of an attempt to solve our major social challenges with the need for a business plan. And we find ourselves dealing with students and faculty and community members and community leaders on a regular basis, and tackling major social challenges both domestically and globally by building partnerships between them. If anybody has any questions about that, I'd love for you to check out our website, which is masoninnovation.org. Tonight's event is part of a series called Venture Camp, which we started about a little less than a year ago. And we did it as an experiment. We had a lot of topics that we wanted to explore together, a lot of interesting people that didn't exactly fit into all of the standard programs that we had. And so we decided we'd partner with Arlington Economic Development and a whole bunch of other folks who you see up on the screen up there, and address these topics in individual sessions in the evenings and see who showed up. And as it turns out, a fair number of people have showed up. The other topics that we've covered or will cover coming up on November 13th, we're going to be doing 3D printing. If you have no idea what that is, you can join a club captained by me. We will have a 3D printer on site, I am told, printing something in 3D for several days before the event, so you can come and check that out in the lobby, and then you can arrive here and discover with me and a lot of other people what that trend is all about. We've also done topics on lean startup and living the startup lifestyle. If any of you have topics that you'd like to explore, you should feel free to think of this as kind of a community. Let us know, and if we can pull together an event like this, we'd be happy to do so. Allow me to mention just a couple of our partners. I mentioned Arlington Economic Development, but none of these events would be possible without the leadership of Jennifer Ives, who's going to stand up and turn around and accept applause at this point. Those of you who pay tax dollars in the Commonwealth would be pleased to know that they are well spent in the efforts of Arlington Economic Development. They do just terrific work, and they've been great partners in this program. I want to also acknowledge Jonathan Naverman. Stand up. Turn around. Yeah, please stand. If you've been to previous events in this series, you recognize him as the provider of pizza, and also our general provider of humor throughout the event. So if things aren't going well, Jonathan gets up, tells a joke, everything starts to go better. But he's been a sponsor of this series from the very beginning, and we appreciate it. I also want to acknowledge in our audience the 16-year president of George Mason University, Alan Merton. Will you please stand? We've all be reassured to know that he is, although he might not any longer be the president of George Mason, he is here to continue to keep us honest in our discussions. So if there is anything that's said that about the business environment in Northern Virginia that predates me, Alan will stand up and tell you whether or not it's right or wrong in terms of characterizing. He's had to deal with all these jokers for 16 years. The last thing that falls to me to do is to just make two brief introductions. First, Alex Werfinger has for 16 years been the publisher of the Washington Business Journal. I asked him if there was anything else that he would like me to say about him by way of introduction, and like a typical journalist, he always wants answers from other people, but is never willing to answer anything himself. So that is the beginning, that is the best job, right? That is the beginning and the end of the introduction, but anyone who is familiar with the business community and journalism about it in Northern Virginia knows that it's a prominent publication, and one that if you're following trends in the area, you just can't deal with that. Finally, it falls to me to introduce Alan Wurtzel, and I'll just say this, I'll talk about some of the typical bio highlights, but I'd like to begin and end simply by saying that Alan and his wife Irene, if you'll just wave your hands, I'll see you. I had the pleasure of getting to know them a number of years ago. The Mason Center for Social Entrepreneurship is itself a product of a merger of a couple of years ago under Merton's presidential direction between an independent nonprofit organization called Phoenix Project, which was trying to advance social entrepreneurship in Virginia, and existing activities that were going on at Mason. We looked in the early years of the Phoenix Project, when no one knew what social entrepreneurship was, to folks in the community who had a real reputation and whose presence on our founding board would send a message to the rest of the world that we were legitimate. And both Alan and Irene agreed to serve and served for many years, and we drew significantly upon their credibility and their stellar reputation in the community to advance the cause. So in many ways, the work that we're doing now is traceable to that early agreement on their part to give their time and their effort. And I would say that Irene is a wonderful playwright, and so if you ever see anything published about plays of hers that are being put on locally, please go see them. They're wonderful productions, and you'll be pleased you did. Alan has had an interesting and diverse career. The reason he's here tonight is most prominently because of his role as an early leader of Circuit City. He served as both CEO and chairman for a good chunk of years, from 1972 through 1994. And then a significant amount of attention was paid to his leadership because Jim Collins' best-selling book, Good to Great, profiled him as one of 11 CEOs who, in many ways, whose leadership exemplified what we should be looking for in growing organizations into corporate citizens. But he's had alternative careers, too many of them to list. But we'll say that he's played a prominent role in education as a member of the Virginia State Board of Education and trustee of Virginia Commonwealth University. He was a member of the Virginia Commission on Higher Education. He has been a director of the Dollar Tree stores, so those of you who are looking for last-minute Christmas presents, like I do on a regular basis, know that's the place to go. Jonathan, if these jokes, any more of these fail, it's...
Well, you're on your own.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it.
This is a tie crowd. You got to time it.
Thank you.
No problem.
He's also served on the board of Office Depot. He is, for those of you who love art, a trustee of the Phillips Collection, where he's done a wonderful job helping them to pull together a world-class collection over the past couple of years. And finally, serves on the Chesapeake Bay Foundation Board. So with no further ado, other than to say that in addition to being a terrific CEO, Alan and his wife are terrific people that I've been really proud to call friends. And if anyone who follows the business community in Northern Virginia knows, frequently business success comes with an attached ego. And what you don't find with Alan and Irene, and what's been a real blessing, I think, for me to enjoy their company over the years, is a real focus on ideas and people, and not a focus on ego. So they're good people in addition to being successful people. And with that, I turn it over to you, sir, to conduct what I'm sure will be a fantastic interview. No pressure.
Well, thank you very much, and it's really a pleasure to be here at George Mason with all of you here, and particularly to spend some time talking with Alan. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Alan, as many of you know, just released his book, Good to Great to Gone, last week. So this will be the primary topic of our conversation today. I'm going to structure a lot of my questions around that, and then hopefully in a little bit of time, I'll turn the floor to you and see if you've got any questions that you'd like to offer to Alan. I hope I'm going to be as funny and entertaining as Jonathan is, but I'm not sure that I can possibly do that.
But you have much greater name recognition in town, and we all respect you a lot more than they respect you. Respect is more important.
So, Alan, I wanted to start at the end of the story as opposed to the beginning of the story. How did you find yourself writing this book?
I mean, basically, I was curious. I knew about Circuit City from 1949 when it was founded, because I was a teenager living at home and my dad started the business. And I knew a lot of the middle history, and I was there for a lot of it. And I stayed on the board till 2000. But in 2000, I left the board, I sold my stock, and I really had no connection with the company. And 9 years later, I mean, it wasn't totally a surprise, but I woke up and found the company was liquidating. And I wanted to try to understand what had happened. I mean, one of the things I say is, I expected, like I expect my children, I expected Circuit City to outlive me. And all of a sudden it died well before I did. And I was curious as to what happened. I like to write, and I wanted to do it in an analytical and hopefully structured so that it might be of some use in a business school or in a business school environment.
Now, and I mentioned this earlier when I was talking to you. I was so surprised as I read the book that you were able to be so analytical and not emotional about it. You had a certain level of detachment as you were writing. How in the world did you do that?
I didn't find it all that hard. I tried to put ego aside. I tried hard not to belittle other people, some of whom made decisions, including my father, that I thought were strategically mistakes. But I tried to look at it objectively. And we can talk a little later about what is strategic planning, but I think if you understand what strategic planning is, there are right ways to do it and wrong ways to do it. And I wanted to be, if I was coming to judgments about how people did it, I wanted to be as bulletproof and objective as possible.
So I am a little bit of a history buff, so I want to just take Alan back a little bit to the founding of the company, and I'm particularly interested in family businesses and how these transitions work from first to second generations. But this was your father's business that he started in the 40s, so can you just give us a little snapshot of how he started it and then how you got into it?
Yeah, I like to say Circuit City was started in a barber shop. And it happened because my father sold a business in New York. He and my mother were taking a vacation in North Carolina, and they stopped in Richmond where my aunt lived on the way. I mean, this is all serendipitous, like a lot of things in life. And while there, he had his haircut. And the barber told him the South's first television station had just opened a few months earlier. And a light bulb went off. We lived in New York. We had some rich friends who had early television in their home. There are only, a handful of cities in the United States where you could watch TV. And so nobody in Richmond had ever seen TV unless they traveled to New York or Chicago or whatever.
This was what year?
1949, just after World War II. The U.S. economy was in great transition. He was down on his luck in one sense, but he was very optimistic. And 2 months later, he was back in Richmond. He bought a dozen table model televisions from a Long Island manufacturer, got a franchise for the state of Virginia, and started what he called Ward's TV.
And why did you, when and why did you decide to join him?
Well, I joined it the first summer because he needed somebody to put antennas up on roofs. I was still in high school. And I spent a couple of hot summers doing that or driving a truck. And when I was in college, I might manage a warehouse, sort of a lower level managerial job. But I knew the company mainly because I listened to a lot of dinner table conversation. And in the summers I worked there at relatively low level jobs.
One of the things that was so striking to me, this is in 1949, what was so striking to me is, really how much has changed in a short amount of time. Television sets, not even being in existence, but then the whole industry of retailing changing.
I couldn't agree with you more. And a lot of the book is about that. For each chapter in the life of Circuit City, I try to set a background of what's happening in the economy, what's happening in competition, what's happening in the industry, etc. And this was the most dramatic period, I think, in American retailing for consumer electronics was the most dramatic example of radical change. In the 50 years, 60 years, from 49 to 09, we went from black and white TVs with 13-inch screens to, the cloud and the internet and all the products in between. But the other thing that was changing was retailing. When I was a teenager, there were basically two forms of retail stores. There were department stores, and most of which are now gone. In Richmond, it was Miller and Rhodes and Thalheimer's, neither of which exist today. And there were mom and pop stores, and there were two chains of 5 and 10s. But other than that, it was all local mom and pop retailing.
I believe that, isn't this building on the site of an Arlington retailer? What was it? Yeah,
Yes.
right next door, yeah, it's in there.
So retailing went from mom and pop department stores, discount stores, which were the big development in the 60s that my dad latched onto. And that's what launched the real beginning of Circuit City as a non-Richmond, non-mom and pop national retailer. At the same time, there were huge changes in America. After World War II, millions of soldiers came back from the war. They started families, and the baby boom, which you all know about, was launched. In the Eisenhower years, we passed the first Interstate Highway Act, and the interstate highways were launched, and suburbia was created, essentially. And within 10 or 12 years, a third of all Americans lived in suburbia. That's an enormous change from 20, 50, 100 years before. Women went into the workforce in large numbers. When I was a kid, my mother didn't work, and I hardly knew any other kids whose mothers were not stay-at-home moms. So, I mean, I could go on, but they were huge sociological changes. I mean, the GI Bill of Rights led to much better, higher levels of education for all Americans. And then finally, just the advent of computers and technology led to enormous increases in productivity. So that by the 80s or 70s and 80s, this was by far the most productive country in the world.
Now, the company made some strategic decisions along the way that latched them onto these sort of socioeconomic changes.
Right.
Can you point out a couple of those important sort of turning points, inflection points?
Well, the most important was in 1959, the first discount store opened called Ann and Hope in Rhode Island, in an old mill. And it was organized, I call it a Turkish bazaar, in that there were lots of independent retailers in that store, but they all operated under one name. So you didn't know that the people selling drugs and the people selling sporting goods, men's clothing, women's clothing, or televisions were all different independent companies, but they worked together under the management to advertise jointly. Well, the discount store took off, and I mean, Kmart was turned from a 5 and Dime store, Kresge's, into Kmart, and Woolco started. Woolco grew out of Woolworths, which was a 5 and 10 cent store, and then lots of other independent entrepreneurs. And my dad saw the opportunity. He latched onto it. Actually, he went public at a very steep price to raise enough money that he could go into a half a dozen, or 10 actually, discount stores. So that was one enormous turning point. I mean, 10 years after that, sales had grown from 2 or 3 million in Richmond to 50 million across the country. I'd say the other major turning point was in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. We went through some difficult times, which I outline in the book. But when I became CEO in '73, I looked around and said, what's the future of retailing for TV and appliances? And I didn't think discount stores were it. Actually, we were in 6 or 7 chains, and every one of them went belly up or liquidated because they were too competitive. But if we could build our own stores, be masters of our own fate, and had the right mousetrap, I thought we could be successful. And I looked around, and the first model I chose was Levitt's Furniture. It was a big box retailer. How many of you know Levitt's? I mean, it's an impressive place to go into, I mean, particularly when they first started. So mountains of furniture, you knew they bought it at low rates, and you could pick it up and take it home. Where previously, if you bought a sofa, you picked out the sofa, you picked out the fabric, in 6 weeks, if you're lucky, 6 weeks later, it was delivered. So somebody had applied the Levitt's formula to TV and appliances. It was a flash in the pan, because they didn't do it right. But that was the second turning point when I decided that this would be the future of the company. And we put all our eggs in that basket. And
So it's having warehouse-type stores, is that?
yes, I mean, the first stores were, you walked in a long corridor and you passed some windows, and behind those windows were service technicians wearing white coats.
Right.
So that was subliminally, if you buy it, we'll fix it, which was a big fear that people had if they bought a TV. What would happen if it broke? So we're saying that we fixed what we sold. And then you turned the corner again and you saw a huge warehouse, and that said, hey, they buy in bulk, they must get low prices. And then you went into the showroom, and it was bright and attractive and massive displays. I mean, 120 TVs all tuned to the same channel on the back wall. I mean, nobody, it's commonplace today, but in 1980, that was a pretty amazing display. So anyway, that's how it started. And as it got more familiar, we didn't need the warehouse and the TV repair people on your way into the store.
So you know, when I was reading your book, you know, there's a lot about retailing that doesn't necessarily apply to my business or about a lot of other people's business, but what did apply was your focus on company values.
Mm-hmm.
And how important that was. And I wanted you, could you spend a little time talking about why that's important and how you did it?
Well, it's important because, I mean, it depends what your values are, but if the values are treating people fairly, and the core philosophy my father laid down was what he called the one-face philosophy. We have one face to the customer, to the employees, and to our suppliers, because we were very dependent. I mean, we were a flea on an elephant when we were dealing with RCA, when we were dealing with General Electric, when we were dealing with these major manufacturers, Whirlpool. So he and his partner decided that the way to succeed was to be transparent and honest. And that was true in dealing with employees, too. We didn't flim-flam up. We didn't. My father's philosophy is if somebody comes and asks you for a raise, and they're entitled to, they need a raise, it's appropriate, he had failed. Because we should know what the market is for whatever the trade, the skill is. So if you're a truck driver, if you're a salesperson, if you're an accountant, bookkeeper, we would systematically canvass the market and find out what's the going rate for a quality person, because you want quality people, you have to pay. His rubric was the 75th percentile, well above average. And then if somebody asked for a raise, he'd say, look, we just did a study. You're being paid at the 75th percentile. We'll review you next year, but we're not going to give you a raise today. And most people, when they understood that, it was transparent, they accepted it. I mean, he believed in promoting. A big part of his philosophy, excuse me, was to trust people, that they would do a good job, and that if you gave them responsibility, they'd use that responsibility appropriately.
You wrote about the changing culture of sales in the book, and talk a lot about, you know, which I never really realized that, you know, in retailing and in your industry there was a sort of what you call bait and switching.
Correct.
And that must have been you know, maybe you could just explain what bait and switch is and how you made this transition culturally.
Okay. I mean, bait and switch is the practice of advertising a low-end product with basic minimal features at a down and dirty price, maybe what you paid for it. And put that in the newspaper, here's a TV for in those days, $299. But it certainly, it didn't have remote control. It didn't have the adjustments that it had other limitations. And so when a customer came in for the $299 item, the salesman's job was to say, okay, you can have that, but let me show you for $20 more, you can get remote control. For another $40, you can get a better antenna and better reception and whatever the features might be on a refrigerator. Obviously, you can imagine different crispers, different butter keepers, whatever. And that's the way things were sold. The first guy that tried the warehouse showroom, Kennedy and Cohn, if you didn't buy the step up from the salesman, he what was called TO'd, turned you over to somebody he identified as the buyer. It was another salesman, but anyway. And you have to go through the same thing. And if that didn't work, they introduced you to the store manager. You couldn't get out of there without either being extremely rude or getting angry or buying a better, and these better featured models were not sold at cost, they were sold at a reasonable gross profit. It was like a used car salesman. It was a very dirty business. And I didn't think that was the wave of the future. Again, it's looking out the horizon, seeing what's happening in what changes are occurring in the culture, just like demographic changes or competitive changes.
That was deeply ingrained in the culture of your industry and the company. How did you change that culture?
First I persuaded my father, which wasn't all that hard, but he would have never initiated it, but the young whippersnapper let him try it. He understood the merits of the argument, obviously. And then I went to the people that ran the business, and I said, this is what we're going to do. And the two key guys reluctantly came along. They weren't enthusiastic, but they said, look, we understand, and we'll support you. Some of their subordinates were dead set against it, and ultimately they needed to find other employment. We tried to reason with them. We kept at it for a number of months. It wasn't, you sign up today or you're out of here. But if they were recalcitrant over a reasonable period of time, then we understood we had to make a change. And one of his principles was separate from people gently. And so we tried to do that. When we fired somebody, we blamed ourselves. Not them, not that you failed, but we didn't give you the right working conditions, the right opportunities, the right environment. But it's not working out here. So good luck and let's be friends.
Let's move forward a little bit into the heyday of the company and when you were in the fast growth mode. And you talked in the book about your four horsemen that you worked with. And I loved your conversation about these four guys that were your critical team. Can you talk about how you built that, how you motivated them, how you worked with them?
Okay. Well, two of them were, I inherited from my father, and they were two terrific guys. One was a high school graduate, and the other had gone to college, a sort of third-rate college, but they were both smart. They both came through the school of hard knocks. They started as salespeople. They were successful. The guy who was in college started as an assistant manager. The other guy with a high school education is a salesperson. And they kept proving their worth. They kept demonstrating that they could take more responsibility. And as the company was growing, we were desperate. He was desperate for people that could take more responsibility. And when I became CEO, we worked collaboratively. We had an executive committee. They were two, and then we hired a financial guy, and he became part of the Four Horsemen, and we promoted somebody who was a low-level buyer, and he became the general merchandise manager. And the four of us basically ran the business. So we added a personnel person, a human resources person in today's parlance. And everything was decided by consensus, up to a point. So we met once a month. We had an agenda of items to talk about. Anybody could put an item on the agenda, And sometimes those meetings lasted all day, or sometimes until the next day. And if we didn't reach consensus, we put it down for the next meeting, and sometimes a third meeting. And my rule was, if at that point we're still repeating ourselves, and nobody's, positions hadn't changed, and more important, the arguments hadn't changed. They were saying, Joe was saying what he'd been saying for 2 meetings, and Sam was saying what he was saying for 2 meetings. Then somebody had to make a decision. And that was the role of the CEO. And everybody accepted that because they had a full opportunity to present their views, their arguments, to go back for a month and think about it and perfect them and come back. And what happened was, most of the time, we arrived at a consensus that was not one extreme or the other. It was a blend of the two views. Yes, we're going to do this, but we're going to do it in a way that doesn't jeopardize what the people who were afraid of and were opposing feared would happen.
You outlined throughout the book a number of habits of mind, you call them, your foundations for organizational success. And I wanted to ask you to, I wanted to talk about a few of them, and maybe you could just sort of tell us a little bit about some examples of how they came into practice.
The way I came up with the concept of the habits of mind was, I wanted to focus on strategic planning. I thought that was the most interesting subject. It's something that interested me the most. And when I thought about it, there are no rules for strategic planning. A plan that George Mason and that Alan made 20 or 16 years ago was a fabulous plan, but that didn't last for 20 years or 16 years, because the world is constantly changing. In our business, the products were changing, the demographics were changing, the competition was changing, and the strategic plan that worked at one point, when there were enough changes, was no longer viable. What works today is unlikely to work tomorrow, and what works in New York may not work in Los Angeles, and certainly not in London or Tokyo or Johannesburg. So strategic planning is ephemeral, or limited to time and place. But when I tried to think deeper about it, what generalizations could you make? I decided that the important ingredient was, what's the attitudes or habits of mind with which you approach strategic planning? Strategic planning is the art and science of matching the resources and strengths of your organization, whether it's a university or a business or a hospital, the resources and strengths with the external environment, so that as that environment changes, you need to keep thinking about how you change the resources or the strategy that you have to continue to be successful. And the habits of mind that I came up with were, first and foremost, be humble, run scared. There are lots of examples in American history where lack of humility or hubris has ruined many an organization. The most obvious example in my mind is what happened to Detroit and the automobile business. They thought that the Japanese could never build. We beat them in World War II. How could they build a better car? How could they build a car that would appeal more to the American consumer? Well, that hubris cost General Motors and Ford and Chrysler dearly. The second habit of mind that I think is important is what I call curiosity sustains the cat. My dad, when he had his haircut, he was curious. Oh, they're opening a TV station. Well, tell me about that. And why would, what would that mean for Richmond? And one thing led to another, and 2 months later, he started Ward's TV. Another rubric, I think, or habit of mine, is that evidence trumps ideology. And I have a fellow member from the State Board of Higher Education here. Alan was a university president. He knows that we all know that in higher education, there's a lot of ideology and not enough evidence. And to make sound decisions, let's say about how to run a university or run Virginia's fleet of universities, you need to be open to evidence and not be bound by ideology that tuition's too high and therefore we're going to prevent universities from raising tuition. That would be one example. So that's the next habit of mine, and I'll stop here, is what I call maintain a current roadmap. And that means maintain an up-to-date strategic plan. And when I made the first strategic plan that launched us on these warehouse showrooms that I discussed earlier, it was actually a 5-year plan. And a couple of years later, I said, you know, I'm not sure that works anymore because there's been enough change. So I started a process of 3-year plans every other year. Some organizations, some companies, you add a year, you drop a year, and you modify your strategic plan every year. I found that leads to sort of automatic and rather autopilot strategic plan, because you don't get a chance to sit down and think about it in any depth. But after 2 years, there's been enough change in the world. 2 years of plans have not worked out as you projected. I mean, it'd be better, might be worse, but 2 years later, you know they're different than what you thought when you made it in the first place. And there are enough changes in the world that you can say, you know, maybe we ought to think about these changes in the competition or product or whatever. And so I found that process of strategic planning every other year with an emphasis on the deep involvement of the CEO. Every CEO doing a strategic, I mean, any size organization, you need people to help you. You need the financial people, you need economists, you need a lot of support, either in the organization or that you bring in. But in the end, the CEO has to put his own stamp on it. He has to believe in it. He has to be able to say to the board, this is why we're doing it, because I believe this is what's going to happen in our sphere of the world over the next 3 years. And to be ready for that, these are the changes we have to make internally.
Alan, when you were one of the companies that Jim Collins wrote about in Good to Great, could you crystallize for us why you made the book?
Well, you know, does everybody understand how we made the book? Jim Collins looked at the record of Fortune 500 companies over 30 years, 65 to 95, and looked at those that had outperformed the S&P by 3 times. And he found there were hundreds of companies that had done it for 5 years. There were scores of companies that had done it for 10 years, but there are only 11 companies that had done it for 15 years. And it's those 11 companies that he then decided to study in depth. What was it about these 11 companies? There were all kinds of different companies. Philip Morris and Fannie Mae and Circuit City and Nucor Steel and Scott Paper, I think it is. Had nothing in common, apparently. But when he looked below the surface, he found half a dozen factors that he thought were common. The one that surprised me, and actually for which I get the most credit in the book, is what he called a level 5 CEO. These companies all had CEOs who were more interested in the success of their company than their own fame or fortune. He said, Jack Welch, GE, he's not a level 5 CEO. Well, that shocked me when he first said it. But his point, and Jack Welch ran a much bigger, much more complicated, actually not more successful in stock price terms, but in many other ways, much more successful and challenging business than Circuit City. But his point was Jack Welch was too much focused on his publicity, his notoriety, his fame, and his remuneration by the company. Circuit City, on the other hand, I kept my salary only modestly higher than the next highest guys, and I didn't talk to the press. I didn't want to tell them what we're doing. I mean, it was you could come into the store and see for yourself, but why should I advertise what our secret sauce is?
We don't like people like you.
In the trade press. Yeah, I know that. But we're friends anyway, right?
So is that, I mean, when he was writing, when Jim Collins was writing the book, is it just essentially the level 5 executive
No.
piece? Or
Jim has, let me get my notes here so I
you take your cheat sheet out.
don't.
I mean, I want to give everybody a little bit of perspective on, you know, why you were one of these good to great CEOs.
I can remember most of them, but, I mean, besides the level 5 CEO, another principle is who gets on the bus? Who do you hire? And what he says, first who, then what? And he talks about Hewlett Packard, two very smart engineers, just came out of Stanford and decided to start a company. And they hadn't decided what they were going to make. Was it, I mean, something electronics, but it was a tape recorders or something else. But they needed the right people, the two of them, and then they hired some really sharp engineers that they knew from Stanford, and 5 or 6 of them. Then they decided what the first product was going to be. I guess it was printers, but whatever it was. And actually Sony Corporation started the same way. The guy who founded Sony in Japan first put together a team and then decided to make TVs. The next principle is, I'm sorry, wrong. Who gets on the bus? It was use technology appropriately. It was intended, so some people bought technology and used it, even though it wasn't really necessary. Using the minimal technology appropriately was a characteristic of these companies. Yeah, okay.
So, that book writes about the success of the company. So capture for us in a few words why Circuit City failed. What happened?
Well, first was hubris.
Mm-hmm.
My successor, who for the first 5 years did a terrific job, I say he did a better job than I would have done, because he was a very technology-oriented guy, and there were lots of wonderful applications for technology that I would have never dreamed of, much less implemented. And so from 86 to, maybe 10 years, of 96, he took the company from $1 billion when I retired to $10 billion, and very successfully. But things were happening in the marketplace. They did the 3-year plans, they understood the changes, but they didn't believe that Best Buy, for example, would ever catch them. I mean, Best Buy was a marginally profitable business. For 5 years, they did something like $5 or $6 billion and made up, I don't know, 50 million or something. I mean, a trivial amount of money compared to the amount of sales that they had. And he just didn't believe Best Buy would ever catch us.
So he just ignored the competition?
He did. He believed, I mean, the fundamental change that was happening in the marketplace, not only with Best Buy, but with the mass merchants, with Kmart and Walmart and Costco and Sam's Clubs, was that you could go in, find what you wanted, pick it up, put it in a cart, and take it to the cash register, just like a grocery store. He insisted on the model that everybody had to talk to a salesperson. And the reason he did that was because of the step-up selling that I just described a minute ago. Here was an opportunity to make more gross profit, legitimate. I mean, we didn't push anybody to the wall, and we didn't turn over the way some people did. But we did require that you couldn't buy it without talking to a salesperson, and at least understand that there were some better products at modestly higher prices that you should think about. If you didn't want it, that was fine. So he was afraid if we gave that up, our gross profits would go to hell in a handbasket. He also didn't like putting out low-end products with low margins, and as a result, we didn't carry TV games. Well, TV games in the 90s, I mean, that was like heroin to a 15-year-old. I mean, they love these things. And so the 15-year-olds were going to Best Buy, which had a huge selection. And the same with CDs. They were selling CDs at $11 when the market was $15. We carried a few CDs, but we did it reluctantly. Computers had low margins. We had computers, but a smaller assortment and didn't carry the peripherals. You couldn't buy the paper and the mouse mouse pad and the other accessories. So,
It was hubris, and what else was?
okay, so that accounts for how we got behind Best Buy.
Right.
He retired in 2000, and his successor was a very nice man and a knowledgeable man, recognized that the company had to change, that we had to change the selling philosophy. And that's what he told the board, but he just never could implement it. I think he had some issues with bold and strong strategic planning to begin with. Executing those plans was another challenge for him. And the third was, it would have required a lot of money. And Wall Street was not looking kindly on Circuit City investing $1 billion to remodel 500 stores. And so they piddled around the edges, but they never did the essential thing, was to bulk out the merchandise so you could pick it up. You had to have much bigger showrooms. We had big warehouses and small showrooms. We needed to combine the two. That was $1 million a store to do that remodeling, and you had to close the store in the process. They never were willing to bite that bullet.
My question might be self-evident when I ask you about that, but after I ask this question, I'll turn to all of you for some questions. Circuit City clearly could still be in existence right now.
But for two things.
That was my question. Yeah.
The last guy destroyed the culture, treated people just the opposite of what I described. At one point, they fired 3,400 the highest priced, the highest earning salespeople. That was bad enough, but then they bragged to Wall Street, hey, look what we did. You should look favorably on our stock because we just fired all this payroll and saved all this money, and never shed one tear or evidenced any concern for the families of these people. Many of them have been with the company for their entire careers. So he destroyed it, and at the same time, he destroyed the morale and the culture. At the same time, the board, again looking to Wall Street, bought back nearly $1 billion worth of stock, $966 million, out the door, buying back stock, not remodeling stores, not changing the sales approach, not doing the things that needed from a strategic standpoint to turn their own company around. And when the typhoon or hurricane of 2008 hit and credit dried up, Circuit City couldn't get credit and it didn't have cash in the bank. And that's why in January of '09, we had no choice but to liquidate the stores.
Well, thank you. Some questions? Can I just, I'll go into that. Just identify yourself for us.
Speak up loudly, please.
Yeah, Todd Cofer, thanks for coming to Arlington. In fact, I was just thinking about it. I remember the days when I used to go as a kid and fiddle through all the CDs at the Circuit City. So I know I'm dating myself, but nonetheless, thanks for that nostalgia, for what you brought to my childhood. Nonetheless, my best friend and I, we started an educational technology company here in Washington, D.C., and the industry that we're getting into is really at a tipping point when it comes to innovation, just helping kids do better in school. It sounds to me like you've been through a couple tipping points yourself, so from the entrepreneurial CEO type perspective, could you give any advice on how you handled that? Thank you.
How you deal with a tipping point?
Yeah.
Seize the day, seize the opportunity.
Yeah.
Seize the opportunity.
Yes. I mean, if you're doing the right strategic planning, if you're looking at what's happening to the customer, to the technology, to the market, and you see the opportunity, then that's the time to go for it. You often can't wait to prove it. You have to see, as you said, seize the day. Now you have to go out and raise money, presumably. But that means you need to be able to persuade people that are interested in investing in startup companies or companies that are at their tipping point to give you another infusion of cash so that you can execute the plan. But you need a sound strategic plan based on what's happening in the outside world and related to the strengths of your organization and a realistic assessment of how much money you need to get from here to there.
Will Fuentes Lemur. Hey, so I have a question. I know you said in 2000 you left and you weren't involved in Circuit City anymore. I'm assuming peripherally people would still come to you and talk to you about what was going on, or your friends would say, hey, have you heard the news? At any point did you ever feel like you wanted to go back and maybe see if you could turn the tide and turn that ship around? Or was it just gone and it was your history now and the legacy was going to
I mean, I flirted with that idea. It would have moved, by then I'd moved up to Washington, had a very nice life here. It would have meant moving back to Richmond. It would have been, 14 and 18-hour days again. And by that time I was, in my 60s. So there were some personal reasons for not doing it. But the idea was tempting, I must admit. And actually my successor was also tempted. And he made a bid, actually, to buy the company out of bankruptcy. But I think it was too little and too late. And so I guess all ex-CEOs have fantasies, and those were his fantasies and my fantasy. But the price of executing on them was pretty high.
Dr. Merton?
Alan, you make a big point of strategic planning, but you also did a lot in terms of targets of opportunity. In the midst of the plan to do something that was not planned, give us an example of some of the things.
Oh, absolutely.
Some of the things maybe you wish you would have done.
Well, let me talk about the ones I did first. And it's in the book. We had a strategic plan to, open Circuit City superstores. We had the Circuit City, many of you in Washington may be familiar with the circuits. The original Circuit City stores were just electronics. They were much smaller stores. And then we converted to the superstores. In the middle of that train, and I always thought, hey, it would be nice to go to Los Angeles and open superstores there. We had licensed apartments. I mean, we had 1,000 people working in Los Angeles, running TV and appliance departments in the one remaining discount chain that we were operating in called Zodi's. And just by chance, I called somebody, asked him whether he was coming to work. Would he be interested in coming to work for us? And he said, no, I can't do that. He said, I've just taken over the liquidation of, what's the name of it? The Akron stores, which was like Pier 1. And he said, they've got 14 terrific stores. They're in great locations. I said, how big are they? He said, 25,000 square feet. I said, oh my God. We could open 14 Circuit City stores in California in one swell swoop, one shot. Otherwise, building that chain would have taken years to one piece of real estate at a time. So that was an opportunity. And we jumped on it, and 3 days later we were in California, and 2 weeks later we had a deal. The other example is I never intended to, we had a plan and we were sticking to it. And my dad called me, this was about 5 years earlier. And he said, Alan, the Lafayette radio chain? How many of you heard of Lafayette Radio or Lafayette Radio Electronics? It was a big chain, particularly in the Northeast, but with Associated like Radio Shack, it had hundreds and hundreds of stores. And he called me one day and said, Alan, they're down to 5 stores, all in New York, and they have a $40 million tax loss carry forward. You ought to go take a look at it. Well, I called the guy. It sounded interesting. The next week I was there. There was more opportunity than just the 5 stores and the $40 million tax loss. And again, buying the company was in Chapter 11, and it was a challenging task. A lot of people had kicked out those tires and passed. But their price had gone down, and being an ex-lawyer, I had a little more confidence about the legal challenges, and we ended up doing it, and it was a transformational. that moved the company ahead because the next $40 million that we earned in the next 4 or 5 years, we didn't pay any taxes. So what it did a tremendous amount to our net worth.
Alan, you outlined a couple of mistakes you made in the book. You know.
I do?
Yeah, how did you know, even if it was in your plan, like how did you know when to cut bait and just get out of it? Or stay in it too long?
Well, one of my plans, I mean, I inherited sort of a mess from my dad. He had done a lot of acquisitions, pretty helter-skelter and all very fast. And at one point, we had 14 different divisions in a company doing $50 million. So the average division was $3 or $4 million at the most. And in a lot of different areas, doing a lot of different, I mean, I knew immediately when I became CEO, we had to consolidate it. We narrowed down basically to 2 formats. The Circuit City, or 3. The Circuit City electronics only stores. Then we started the superstores, which were electronics and so-called white goods, which kitchen appliances. And we kept that Zodi's chain because it was doing a lot of business and making money, and we needed it as a cash cow during the transition. So,
Can you point to anything that you just sort of eliminated other than that? I mean, later on, just decisions that were in your plan that you needed to...
well, one of the mistakes I made, or several of them in the book, was with real estate. Originally, I didn't think Circuit City needed A double plus real estate, or A real estate, because we were relatively unique, and people would come to us. We had this terrific offering. And one of my principles is keep it simple, and the simple was the 4 S's. Circuit City offered savings, unprecedented savings. We guaranteed the lowest price. Savings, selection. We had more TVs, more refrigerators, more washers and dryers than any of our competitors. Saving, selection, service. We not only had good, well-trained salespeople to help you pick the product, and we spent a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of effort on that. And we had service after the sale in our own service department. And finally, we guaranteed satisfaction. Those were the 4 S's, and that's what we pushed, and that's what built the business. Now, I didn't think with that we needed what I call main real estate, because people would come to us, and we were the only major player with those principles and delivering that consumer satisfaction. And that turned out to be a mistake. I mean, Best Buy outflanked us in a number of markets with better real estate. We also thought that each store, we had a sort of a precious attitude towards how the stores looked. I mean, we wanted to show the merchandise to the best advantage. Each one of them was a jewel. And so we spent a lot of money in fixtures and lighting and antennas and connections so that everything was up and working. When a customer came in, it was like going into Tiffany's and seeing the diamonds in exactly the best light. And that was great, except that 3 years later, the diamonds were bigger or smaller, or actually were never bigger. Everything got smaller. And different configurations, different products that didn't exist 3 years earlier. Now we had to make room for video cameras and not just video players, and it became inflexible and expensive, and keeping all those fixture and display changes current in hundreds of stores became a nightmare. So that was another mistake.
Yes.
My name is Diana Fleming. It's a very curious, interesting story. I would like to be able to read the book, because obviously you cannot cover the kinds of information I'd be interested in knowing. But given the fact that you have 50-year history with second generation and hopefully third generation and fourth generation management, I'm wondering if you had developed any kind of exit planning. You talk about your 4 horsemen. Were they shareholders in the company? Did you have a shareholder plan for employees? What were sort of your exit strategy? Because the company obviously had gone public. And I would imagine it went public when?
Oh, we were public.
You went public?
My dad went public, I think I said, when the sales were tiny.
Right.
2.5 million in sales, and he sold 40% of the company.
So then, were there private equity financing that came into the picture, where management was brought on board in order to run?
Well, management had, we had a generous option program,
Mhm.
so that as the company grew and people stayed with the company, I mean, there were quite a few millionaires created
Right,
at Circuit City because we had an option, a stock option program.
right. But the
We
buyout,
would raise additional money as we needed it. I raised money twice from Goldman Sachs
through a private,
no, just, it was a public company.
okay.
We sold stock to Goldman Sachs sold stock to the public. The proceeds came to the company, not to the owners, but to the company. And that enabled us to grow. The individuals, because it was a public company, as they either bought stock or exercised their stock options, they were worth more and more money as the stock went up, and they could sell those. So they had personal exit strategies. But I don't think an exit strategy is a concept for a private company. For a public company, I mean, General Motors does not have an exit strategy. I mean, they may have exited, but that was not their strategy.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening. Thanks again for the talk again. I also had the same experience, growing up with Circuit City as well. I was curious when you talked about failure. The first word that you mentioned was hubris. And I'm just, having worked with entrepreneurs, and this is kind of my fourth startup now, what kind of things would you implement looking back to overcome something like hubris? It's something that, we've talked about for generations, and that never seems to go away. Are there things that you would do now to maybe try to overcome that if you could go back?
What this book does, at the end of every chapter, it shows how the 12 habits of mind, I've talked about 4 or 5 of them, how those habits of mind applied to the circumstances the company was facing at that particular time. So that at the end of every chapter, there are, 3, 4, 5 habits of mind, whatever I thought was relevant to explain what happened, positively or negatively, during that particular segment of the company's life. And if you read it and understand it and believe it, then you got to say to yourself, how do I apply those habits of mind to my business? And what in the planning that I'm doing, am I being arrogant? Am I being curious? Am I letting ideology trump evidence? Am I letting, am I creating a team so that people are working together? Am I keeping it simple and accountable so that everybody in the organization understands it? So you can use those habits of mind as a checklist to say, am I doing it the way that it appears to be appropriate to create the best and most viable strategic plan?
Roger?
It seemed to me that, Josh Krieger, thank you, by the way, for sharing your experiences. It would seem to me that moving forward, the electronics market is a very difficult market for any kind of newcomer to walk into. What kind of opportunities do you think there are for innovation and new entryways into the market at this point, and to what extent is that from an online perspective versus a bricks and mortar perspective?
Well, Best Buy and everybody else that's still selling electronics is struggling mightily with Amazon and other, and that's true for Costco and Walmart and even other big chains. It's hard to beat Amazon on price. They sell it at or near cost. They expand based on the cash flow because they have big depreciation. They have cash flow every year, whether or not they make a profit. And so when you're competing with somebody that's working at or close to the cost or margin of their products, and is also, doesn't have the expense of a showroom, doesn't have a distribution, I mean, uses FedEx or UPS and buys that important ingredient, again, at good pricing. It's hard to compete with them. I mean, I think where Best Buy and others need to compete is not on price, but on service. And Best Buy has started that, and it's quite successful with the Geek Squad. Amazon cannot come into your house on the internet and set up your home theater, or fix your computer, or connect your computer to your printer, to your cable, or whatever.
Now they've partnered with this new company that offers like this direct ship, like service repair for 3 years, so they're even competing there.
Okay, so the market's continuing to change. But Amazon, I mean, you can't compete with that. I mean, Best Buy, I think, has a hard time competing on price, but they can't compete, but they could compete on service. Now, the next question is, could they compete on the service of providing good consumer information? So that if you wanted to buy a new TV, or a new computer, or a new home theater, instead of just giving away what I think is relatively shoddy or inexperienced or inexpert advice, because most of their salesmen, I mean, I don't mean to disparage Best Buy, but they're not experts, many of their salespeople. Suppose I had really good and highly trained salespeople. Would you be willing to pay them 25 or 50 bucks for the advice if you didn't buy the product? So that's something that maybe a third-party provider could provide objective advice as to what products to buy from Best Buy or Amazon, for that matter, and how to put them together, how do you compare, because, anyway, Amazon, there's nobody at Amazon you can talk to.
Good evening. My name is Gadsden Jerry. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. It's definitely a great idea. And Dr. Martin, thank you for coming out. I'm George Mason student. Thank you. My question, we spoke earlier about leaning towards evidence more than ideology. And you spoke about your 12 habits. Now, how did you come up by developing these 12 habits? And is it an ideology, or is it more of something that you work towards in evidence? You know, something as a result of evidence?
No, I looked at 60 years of strategic, decisions, many of which we've talked about tonight, and thought about who were the people, most of whom I knew, how did they approach it, and did those habits work or not work? And it was from the evidence of, this is one way to talk about this from a business school standpoint, is this is a 60-year case study. I don't know, I mean, I'm not a student of case studies, but I don't know that there are many that trace a company for 60 years, sort of year by year, decade by decade, and look at strategic planning decisions and and execution, and how they worked out. So it's the evidence of how this worked out at Circuit City on which I based the 12 habits of mind.
Alan, you talk a lot about the strategic planning part of it, but the other part of the book is really on the execution piece. You put a lot of emphasis on, you could be a great strategic planner, but if you can't execute it, if you can't put it in place, it's worth nothing. Go ahead.
So that actually gets to my question. I've been in a strategic planning role for the last 10 years, and with the company I work with, we every year update the 3-year plan. I was fascinated to hear you say you would go every other year, and wondered, how did you keep folks motivated on the execution in those off years when you weren't planning?
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's execution is critical. But first you have to know what you're doing. And so I focused on first what, and less, I mean, some of this book is on how. You keep motivated the way any organization, whether it's George Mason or Fairfax Hospital. I mean, you attract good people, you try to create a culture, try to create a caring culture. In a for-profit organization, you reward people. I mean, in any organization, you reward them with promotion, with more responsibility, with recognition, with authority. And in a for-profit, you also reward them with money. And particularly in a public for-profit with stock options. And I don't think that's rocket science. If you have a decent understanding of people and you treat them decently and you listen to them and treat them with respect and then reward them in both financially and non-financial ways, you will create loyalty and support and a successful organization.
So I actually have a corollary question about that. Given how technology is changing so quickly now, would you, if you were starting today, would you still have that approach of updating the strategic plan every other year?
Absolutely. I don't think it has anything to do with technology. It's having the time to step back and look thoughtfully rather than mechanically at what's happened in the last period of time. And the CEO has to do it. He's got to put a lot of his own heart and soul and brain power into that plan. And if you do it every year, it's too big a burden, in my opinion, for most CEOs, and there's not enough time to reflect and to see. Because, as I said before, you're never going to, the results will never match the plan. They may be better, they may be worse, but they'll be different. And that gives you enough time to reflect on what those differences are and why they happened.
I'll take one last question, right there.
You?
Okay, I'm Shawanda Green, and I've heard several entrepreneurs say that the greatest change happens outside of your comfort zone. And so what I'm wondering
Greatest
is
change happens?
outside of your comfort zone. So when you act outside of your comfort zone, you progress farther. And so I'm wondering for you at Circuit City, what actions did you take that you were uncomfortable with that led to the greatest and most positive change?
You know, I mean, sometimes I fired people. When we got into financial trouble, which I haven't talked about tonight, but there was a period that's detailed in the book, I had to let people go. Some of them were terrific people and good friends, but the survival of the company depended on it. So that was certainly outside my comfort zone. I think one of the things, and this may be unique to me, one of the things I liked about running Circuit City was I liked challenges. And one of the reasons, the main reason I retired early from Circuit City was, I'd say, the learning curve had flattened out. I mean, the first time I built a $3 million or $4 million store, 35,000 square feet, I mean, it was mind-boggling, and I was not comfortable and was unsure about how to do it. How do you buy the land? What covenants? What lawyers? What contractors? How do you design the store? I mean, you do something like that for the first time, it's beyond your comfort zone. And the same with a warehouse, or the same with a stock offering, or the same with an employee compensation plan, or a retirement plan. I mean, all those things were outside my comfort zone the first time I did them. And they were exciting the second and third and often the fourth time, because I learned from my mistakes, and I hopefully got, at least I got confirmed in my beliefs, whether they were right or wrong. I got comfortable with the decisions I made about how to design a warehouse or how to design a profit-sharing plan, let's say, a retirement plan. But by the 5th or the 25th or whatever, it was no longer challenging. I was in my comfort zone, and the learning curve had flattened out. And being a restless and person who likes new challenges, I decided to tell my board I was going to recruit a successor and train him, and in 5 years I'd be gone. If at the end of that 5 years my successor didn't work out, I would do it again. But after that, the board was on its own. And that's that's the basis on which I effected the transition. I actually found a terrific guy, and at least for the first 10 years, he did a great job. So I hope that answers your question.
Join me in thanking them for their time.
I just want to thank Greg, which I should have done at the beginning, and George Mason, and Alan Merton, and the Arlington Chamber of Commerce. I really enjoyed this. And someone said if they'd like to read the book, there's something on sale out in the lobby.
Yes, buy the books. And November 13th, 3D printing back here. We'll figure out what it is. And then if you have any other ideas of interesting things, interesting people, interesting ideas that you've read about, you want to learn about, let us know, and we'll try and pull something together. Thank you very much for coming out.